So, good evening, good afternoon, friends. So, in this payments industry, of course, the biggest negative, as was being discussed in the previous session, is all kinds of frauds and thefts that take place. And unfortunately, with all the advances in technology, things are not getting under control. That's the challenge. How much worse will it get before it gets better is the kind of question that everyone has in their mind. I'm doing online banking, I'm doing mobile banking, I'm doing online payments, all that. But is it going to get worse? If so, then maybe people will start withdrawing. So to kind of explore this, understand this scenario further, we have with us James Cook. He's with the Thales group. It specializes in eSecurity. And they recently did a research, global research, which covered India as well. So we'll try to dig a little bit into this research and whatever personal insights you have, James, and see what value we can extract out of this discussion. So what is this year annual research report for 2018? What did it identify in terms of data breaches, in terms of variety of attacks? What were its findings? What were its major findings?
Sure. Well, thanks, Manoj, and good afternoon to everybody. As Manoj, I guess just as a quick introduction to say, I work with Thales eSecurity. We're a data protection company, and the background to some of the questions that Manoj is asking me is about a global data threats survey. It's a piece of research that we've been doing for a number of years now in conjunction with a company called 451 Research. They're a very well-respected organization who specialize in doing research around IT and IT security. And it's a global survey that is in its 6th year currently. And the idea of the survey is to discover some trends and attitudes around data security worldwide. And the survey is, as I say, it's in its 6th year, and it's allowed us to really start to identify some trends around data security, which hopefully we can share with you a little bit today. And interestingly, I'll tell you what I will do is I'm going to pull out my crib sheet now, because as you can imagine, a survey like this is really quite stat heavy. So I want to make sure I get some of the stats correct. But to your question, Manoj, it's really interesting, because I think the trend that we've seen emerging over the past few years, and also has certainly come to the fore in this iteration of the survey, is what we call the big disconnect. And it's really quite unusual, because we're seeing two things that really appear that really shouldn't be happening at the same time. The first thing that we're seeing is that spending on security, IT security, data protection is rising every single year. And that's across the board. Every single country worldwide that we survey, they are spending more and more on data security. So that's the good news. The flip side to that is, and what we see that's quite unusual, is that at the same time, the number of breaches that are occurring are also going up. So as I say, that's why we call it the great disconnect, because it seems a paradox. And let me quote some of my stats, which is hopefully interesting for some of you. So from the survey, 67% of respondents in total said that they have had some sort of data breach, and 36% of those have had a breach in the past year alone. So it really gives you an idea of how big a problem data breach is right now worldwide.
Okay, so that is the main finding?
Yeah, indeed.
Okay.
That's really what we're saying.
Okay. What does it say about India compared to the rest of the world, or specific to India?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And as you say, Manoj, India is one of the countries that we survey, and clearly, people like myself and guys like yourselves who are really interested in what's happening in India. It reveals some interesting stuff. Now, the headline that we see actually paints a fairly grim picture, but as ever, When you dig under the surface, the picture is somewhat different. So, I quoted some of the worldwide stats for data breach. If we look at the stats for India, to give you an example, 75% of the people who were surveyed as part of the research in India said they'd had some sort of data breach. Of those, 52% said they'd been breached in the last year, and 23% of those had had multiple breaches. And those are the highest breach figures of any country that was surveyed. So on the face of it, it paints a fairly grim picture. But just to look under the surface, it actually starts to paint a slightly different picture. And that picture is that the other thing that we also saw is that India is also leading the world in terms of adopting new technologies. We're really seeing that India's at the forefront of using technology for digital transformation. So again, to give you some idea, 100% of those people surveyed were using some sort of cloud solution. 100% had a big data strategy, 100% had an IoT strategy, 99% were using or planning to use some sort of blockchain solution. So what that tells me is that actually India is at the forefront of using technology for digital transformation. But unfortunately, sometimes that's at the cost of the security aspect of it. But here's the final thing, Manoj, and I think this is really worth pointing out, is the great news is that's being recognized. Because the one stat that is coming out of this is that from the people we surveyed in India, it had the highest amount of spending on IT security planned for future years. So clearly people have recognized a problem and they're doing something to address it, which is great news.
That's good news. That gives some degree of confidence.
Indeed.
Into the digital ecosystem that's evolving in this country. So you mentioned adoption of various technologies as one of the potential drivers of the growth and the threat. One thing we see is phones have become ubiquitous in India, and that has become the first point of contact for the youngsters to get into the digital ecosystem. And unlike, for example, my generation, which started PCs and then with laptops, and clearly we know that phones are a little less secure than PCs in general, whether it's the operating system, whether it is antivirus, whether it is anti-malware, whatever it is. Do you think the widespread adoption of phones is one of the, and other such devices, all these new devices tend to be less secure than a typical PC, right? This IoT thing is about mostly unsecured devices. You see that as playing some role in perhaps these data breaches, or the data breaches are more in the data center and stuff like that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and that goes to the heart of what we've been seeing over recent years. Gone are the days where data was just stored in a single place within a data center. That was the case 5-10 years ago, and at that point the protection strategy was really very much of building a ring of steel around that data because it was all in one place. But exactly as you say, data now lives in a whole range of different places. It lives in the cloud, it lives on people's phones, it does live in the data center, but it lives in many different places in the data center. So we're now dealing with a completely different, data being in a completely different range of places. And clearly what that does do is that increases the attack surface, that increases the number of places that people can attack data. So it means that the protection strategy needs to evolve as well. So a perimeter security solution, in my opinion, and certainly from the research, doesn't really meet the requirement. Really now we need to look at different ways of doing it, and we're increasingly seeing encryption as the go-to technology for people who are trying to solve those problems.
Okay. Because today, just to extend what I said, I see 8-year-old and 10-year-old kids having their own phones. And literally those phones are unmonitored. These kids will download anything, they will go to any website, will play any game, and I don't know, so personally it gives me a lot of fear. Because it's not just the child, but the entire family that's getting exposed. They're connected to the same Wi-Fi, there'll be family pics and all that. But, that's going to happen, so people like you'll have to figure out some solution for that as well.
We'll try.
How to handle 5-year-old kids and 10-year-old kids and 95-year-old adults as well, But let's go further. So I presume this survey was among businesses rather than individuals. How was it?
Absolutely. So the survey was very much focused on IT security professionals.
IT security professionals.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So these companies are planning to spend more on securing their systems and their data. But how are they planning to do it? What kind of trends does your research identify?
So we're seeing some interesting trends, and I think what really comes out of the survey again is another disconnect. So when because part of the survey focus on what do the respondents feel is the most effective in terms of preventing data breach. And what we find from that is that people, for example, believe that if you focus on protecting data at rest, that will have the largest impact in terms of improving the overall security posture of a business. Likewise, they see something like endpoint security as being much lower down the list, not having as much impact on security. So, however, what we then see, which is really strange from the survey, is that when you look at where people are spending money to hopefully resolve these problems, we see those situations reversed. So what we end up seeing is people actually spending money on and planning to spend money on endpoint security, and the spending patterns to protect data at rest are fairly low down, which seems really quite a strange development.
Yeah, that doesn't kind of make sense. So did they figure out why? Is that a historical mindset or something, or just a belief system?
Well, it's interesting, and we can certainly speculate a little bit as to why we think that is. And again, the survey may give us a clue there. And because what the survey tells us is that one of the barriers to implementing data protection solutions is two things. The first is perceived complexity, and the second thing is the fact that they believe it will slow down the performance of the business systems. So we can assume, and to say this is speculation, but we can assume from that potentially people see things like endpoint security solutions as quick and easy to implement, don't really have an impact on the business systems, whereas they see data at rest solutions as perhaps being something that's more disruptive and something that's a little bit more complex to implement. Now, I would contend that's not the case, but we can speculate that perhaps that's the thought process behind it.
So kind of I get the impression many of these security experts are choosing the easy way out rather than the right way.
Quite possibly. Quite possible, okay. So what kind of technology should they look for to really maximize the protection, to minimize the breaches, data thefts, ransomware, those kind of stuff, all that kind of stuff? Well, you set them up, Manoj, and I'll knock them in. So thank you for teeing me up for that one. So as I say, we're an encryption company. And the good thing from our perspective is that we're seeing the technologies that are really coming to the fore are really around encryption. And that's what people are seeing as being the solution to many of the problems. So let me go to my crib sheet, because from the survey, 44% of people who were interviewed said that they saw encryption as the top tool for facilitating, for example, increased cloud usage. The same for driving big data adoption, IoT, container deployments, all of these things that people surveyed said that encryption was a key enabler. But perhaps the one that's really telling is, consistently we see this from the survey year on year, is that people see encryption as the most effective way of meeting data privacy regulation. And we're all aware of things like GDPR, we have our own IT Act, there are increasing amounts of data privacy regulation evolving around the world, and the survey tells us that IT security professionals are increasingly seeing encryption as the go-to solution to solve those problems and to meet those regulations.
So maybe, I'm getting the impression that rather seeing themselves as IT security professionals, they should see themselves as data security professionals. Maybe that's some kind of mindset. Maybe business owners would be more focused on data security because they really care about the data. They don't care about the IT. IT comes and goes. As the previous panel was discussing, IT quickly becomes obsolete. But I guess the value is there in the data itself. IT is part of the business model, is what I learned from the previous panel.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Data is the lifeblood of most businesses, for sure.
Yes. So in encryption, are there any... so how has encryption become better over the last, let's say, 12 months or 24 months? Has that technology evolved, or are we using the same technology that was there 5-10 years ago?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And the answer is yes. It's so encryption is nothing new. And on the face of it, encryption's quite straightforward. Many of the solutions that you guys will be deploying on a daily basis will have an encryption element to them, perhaps some sort of native encryption solution. If you're using a SQL database or an Oracle database, you have an encryption element. Many of the cloud offerings have an encryption element to them. Many disks have an encryption capability. Encryption's nothing new. However, what we are seeing is that encryption is becoming increasingly siloed. And if you have multiple encryption solutions within your organization, that introduces multiple problems. It becomes very difficult to manage. It becomes inconsistent within the business. How do you manage the keys? So in terms of how do we see the developments, what we're seeing now, and Thales eSecurity is leading the way here, is having encryption solutions that can manage all of those different silos, if you like, and have a consistent approach to it.
So does that mean that you can manage keys for encryption solutions from different vendors? Is that, or something else?
No, you're absolutely spot on. That is one of the things that we can do. So many of you will be familiar with enterprise key management. Things like KMIP, which is an attempt to have standardization of encryption keys. So yeah, certainly one of the things that we can do is to help people have more consistency in terms of managing their keys across multiple encryption solutions.
Okay. So James, we talked about the security, the threat report. We talked about the mismatch between data protection and IT protection. And we talked about encryption as being one of the key enablers of data protection. But tell us a little bit, what does your company do, or what has it done in the recent past? What does it propose to do that will actually make data protection much more meaningful, that would actually make data secure? How does your company propose to do that?
Yeah, so there's a number of things that we can do, but I would go back to the silo analogy that I used previously. Okay. Encryption in itself is not difficult to do, but it's making it work for the business efficiently that's most important. Because again, if you have multiple encryption solutions, multiple key management solutions, it becomes increasingly difficult to manage. And that plays into the issue that we see around the perception of complexity in terms of deploying security solutions. We very much want to get away from that. So at Thales eSecurity, we have something called the Vometric Vometric encryption platform. And what that is, that's a standardized approach to encryption. So instead of having multiple solutions across multiple silos, it allows you to quickly and easily provide encryption and tokenization and key management across all of those solutions. It also does it in a way that's managed, which clearly has huge return on investment implications. And finally, it really means that it pays back the it means that the whole business of encryption is rendered much more useful to an organization. It's no longer costly and complex for an organization as it's historically been perceived as being.
So I'm sure something like this would definitely work in a data center, but does it work on laptops and phones and smartwatches and things like that?
So what we're not, and I think is important to point out, is Thales eSecurity is very much a data at rest. Our real aim is to protect data at rest. And again, if we go back to the survey, people perceive that protection of data at rest is probably the most effective way of improving the security posture of an organization. So we're not an endpoint encryption solution. We're very much, but what we don't just focus on is, for example, data that is in a database on premise. As I said previously, people now have now have their data on premise. They have it in databases, they have it in big data solutions, they have it in cloud, they have hybrid cloud. But particularly in India, people are going for multi-cloud deployments.
Yes.
And again, the Vometric data security platform allows you to efficiently encrypt and manage and enforce policy over the data and the encryption on those platforms wherever that data lies.
Okay, got it. Any questions for James from any of our delegates? I guess not. I guess everyone has understood.
I must have answered all of the questions.
And you answered all the questions, true. Great. So let's call it close to this session then. Thank you, James.
It's my pleasure. Thanks,
Thank
Manoj.
you.
Nice to talk to you.
And I wish these technologies take India down. The research said that India is one of the most vulnerable countries today. I really hope in our next year's survey, we are not on the top of that list.
Well, as I say, judging by the amount that people are planning to spend, I think that will probably be the case.
I hope so too. Thank you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.